Marcus Thompson had always been the type of person who judged things by their appearance. At 28 years old, he worked as a successful real estate developer in the wealthy suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. He drove a brand-new BMW, wore expensive suits, and believed that success could be measured by how shiny and new everything looked. His whole world revolved around appearances, profit margins, and impressing the right people. On this particular Saturday morning in March, Marcus was driving through a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He had taken a wrong turn while heading to a golf course and found himself in an area he would normally never visit. The houses here were small and old, with peeling paint and overgrown yards. It was the kind of place that made Marcus wrinkle his nose in disgust. As he slowly drove down the narrow street, looking for a way back to the main road, something caught his eye. In the backyard of a small weathered house sat what appeared to be an old helicopter. Marcus slowed his car to get a better look. The aircraft was clearly ancient, with faded paint, rust spots, and patches of metal that had been welded and re-welded over the years. Marcus couldn't help but laugh out loud. Who in their right mind would keep such a piece of junk in their backyard? The helicopter looked like it hadn't flown in decades. Parts of it were clearly missing, and what remained looked like it belonged in a scrapyard rather than someone's property. He pulled over and got out of his car, unable to resist taking a closer look at what he considered to be a perfect example of poor people holding on to worthless junk. The fence around the property was low, and Marcus could see the helicopter clearly from the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, planning to share them with his wealthy friends as a joke about how some people lived. As Marcus stood there, chuckling to himself and taking photos, an old man emerged from the small house. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of many years spent outdoors. He walked with a slight limp and wore simple work clothes, faded jeans and a plain t-shirt that had seen better days. The old man noticed Marcus by the fence and approached slowly. "Can I help you with something, son?" he asked in a quiet, polite voice. Marcus barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, I was just admiring your helicopter," he said with obvious sarcasm. "Must have cost you a fortune to maintain that beauty." The old man's name was Henry Rodriguez, though Marcus didn't bother to ask. Henry had lived in this house for 42 years, ever since he returned from his military service. He had worked various jobs over the decades: construction, security, maintenance, always honest work that paid the bills, but never made him wealthy. "She's been with me a long time," Henry said simply, looking at the helicopter with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Marcus laughed again. "I bet she has. When was the last time that thing actually flew? The 1970s? He continued taking pictures, zooming in on the rust spots and faded paint. "You know, you could probably make some money selling that metal for scrap. Might even be able to afford some decent landscaping with the proceeds." Henry remained quiet, watching as this well-dressed young man mocked something that clearly meant nothing to him but everything to Henry. The old veteran had encountered people like Marcus before, individuals who measured worth only in dollar signs and appearances. "Are you interested in helicopters?" Henry asked, genuinely curious about what had drawn this stranger to stop and stare. "Interested in helicopters?" "Sure, when they're actually worth something," Marcus replied, still focused on his phone. "I've been thinking about buying one myself, actually. A new one, of course. Something that actually flies and doesn't look like it came from a junkyard." Marcus went on to describe the luxury helicopter he was considering purchasing. It would cost more than most people earned in 5 years, with leather seats, modern electronics, and a pristine paint job. He spoke about it the way some people might describe a work of art, focusing entirely on its cost and status symbol value. Henry listened patiently as Marcus bragged about his wealth and success. The young man seemed to feel the need to prove that he was important, that he belonged to a different class of people entirely. He mentioned his expensive car, his house in the wealthy part of town, and his successful business ventures. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, gesturing toward the helicopter. "You're holding on to the past instead of moving forward. That thing is just taking up space and bringing down your property value." "Not that property values matter much in this neighborhood anyway." The comment stung, but Henry didn't show it. He had heard similar remarks before from people who assumed that because his house was small and his belongings were old, he must be unsuccessful or lazy. They never bothered to learn his story or understand that not everyone measured success the same way. "Sometimes old things have more value than people realize," Henry said quietly. Marcus snorted. "Value? The only value that thing has is whatever someone might pay for scrap metal. And honestly, they'd probably charge you to haul it away." As Marcus continued his mockery, a few neighbors began to notice the commotion. Mrs. Chen from next door peered over her fence, shaking her head at the rude young man. She had known Henry for 20 years and considered him one of the most respected men in the neighborhood. Tommy Martinez, a teenager who lived across the street, stopped bouncing his basketball to listen to what was happening. These neighbors knew Henry's story, or at least parts of it. They knew he was a veteran who had served his country with honor. They knew he was the kind of man who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and never asked for anything in return. They knew he had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier and still visited her grave every Sunday with fresh flowers. What they didn't know, and what Marcus was about to discover, was the true history of the seemingly worthless helicopter that sat rusting in Henry's backyard. Marcus finished taking his pictures and prepared to leave. "Well, thanks for the entertainment," he said dismissively. "Maybe consider calling a scrap dealer. That eyesore isn't doing anyone any favors." As Marcus walked back toward his BMW, Henry called out to him. "Son, would you like to know something about that helicopter before you go?" Marcus paused, his hand on his car door. Something in the old man's tone made him turn around. For the first time, he really looked at Henry, not just glanced at him dismissively, but actually looked. There was something in the veteran's eyes, a depth that suggested experiences far beyond what his modest appearance might indicate. "What about it?" Marcus asked, his voice still carrying traces of arrogance but with a hint of curiosity. Henry walked closer to the fence, his limp more noticeable now. "Why don't you come take a closer look? There might be more to see than you think." Marcus hesitated. He had places to be. Important places, he told himself. But something about Henry's invitation intrigued him. Maybe it was the way the old man carried himself, with a quiet dignity, that Marcus was only now beginning to notice. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed Henry through the gate and into the backyard. Up close, the helicopter looked even more battered than it had from the street. But as they approached, Henry pointed to something that Marcus had missed from his distant vantage point. On the side of the aircraft, barely visible beneath layers of faded paint and surface rust, was the outline of what appeared to be a military marking. Marcus squinted, trying to make out the details. "Is that—" Marcus began, but Henry held up a hand. "Before I tell you what you're looking at," Henry said, "let me ask you something. Do you know what it means when someone has really earned something? Not bought it, not inherited it, not been given it because of who they know, but truly earned it through sacrifice and service?" Marcus felt uncomfortable with the question. His success, while legitimate, had come relatively easily. He had been born into a middle-class family, received a good education, and built his business through smart investments and favorable market conditions. He had never really been tested in the way Henry's question seemed to suggest. "I suppose," Marcus said uncertainly. Henry nodded and pointed again to the faded marking on the helicopter's side. "Take another look. Tell me what you see." Marcus leaned closer, and as his eyes adjusted to the shadows and weathered surface, he began to make out the shape more clearly. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The marking wasn't just any military insignia. It was something much more significant, something that would change everything he thought he knew about the old man standing beside him and the worthless machine they were examining. The outline of a panther, painted in black, was barely visible beneath the years of wear and weather. Marcus had seen enough war movies and documentaries to recognize what this might mean, but he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were telling him. "Is that—" Marcus started again, but this time his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. Henry's expression remained calm, but there was something else there now, a sadness mixed with pride. The look of a man who carried memories that most people could never imagine. "That's just the beginning of the story," Henry said softly. "The question is, are you ready to hear the rest?" Marcus stared at the faded Black Panther marking, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was seeing. The symbol was barely visible, worn down by decades of weather and neglect, but it was unmistakably there. His earlier confidence began to crumble as he realized he might have stumbled into something far more significant than a neighborhood oddity. Henry noticed the change in Marcus's expression and nodded slowly. "I can see you're starting to understand," the old man said. "Why don't we go inside? I'll make some coffee and tell you what you're really looking at." Marcus wanted to decline, to make his excuses and leave this uncomfortable situation behind. But something held him there. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps guilt, or maybe just the growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake in his assumptions about this quiet veteran. Henry's house was small but immaculately clean. The furniture was old but well-maintained, and the walls were covered with photographs that Marcus barely glanced at as they walked through to the kitchen. Henry moved slowly but purposefully, filling a coffee pot with water and measuring out grounds with the precision of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times. "My wife Maria used to make the best coffee in the neighborhood," Henry said as he worked. "After she passed, I had to learn to do it myself. Took me about 2 years to get it right." Marcus sat at the small kitchen table, feeling increasingly out of place in his expensive suit. The house smelled like coffee and something else, a mixture of old wood and memories that seemed to permeate every corner. As the coffee brewed, Henry disappeared into another room and returned with a large, worn photo album and a manila folder stuffed with documents. He set them on the table carefully, as if they contained precious cargo. "Before I show you these," Henry said, "I want you to understand something. That helicopter out there isn't junk. It's not scrap metal or an eyesore. It's a piece of history, and more than that, it's a memorial." The coffee finished brewing, and Henry poured 2 cups. He sat down across from Marcus and opened the photo album to the first page. The black and white photograph showed a much younger Henry in military fatigues, standing next to the same helicopter that now sat in his backyard. But in the photo, the aircraft looked completely different, pristine, powerful, and clearly military in nature. "This was taken in 1971, Henry said. "I was 22 years old, fresh out of flight training, and about to be deployed to Vietnam for my second tour." Marcus studied the photograph more carefully. The young Henry looked confident and strong, nothing like the humble old man sitting across from him. The helicopter in the image bore clear military markings, including the Black Panther insignia that was now barely visible on the weathered aircraft outside. "You were a pilot?" Marcus asked, his voice much quieter than it had been earlier. "Not just any pilot," Henry replied, turning to the next page. "I flew with the 1st Cavalry Division, specifically with a unit that specialized in rescue operations behind enemy lines. That helicopter you were photographing, she saved more lives than I can count." The next several pages of the album showed various photographs from Henry's time in Vietnam. There were images of the helicopter in different locations, always with the distinctive black Panther marking visible. There were photos of Henry with his crew, young men who looked barely old enough to shave, let alone fly dangerous missions in a war zone. We called her Shadow, Henry continued, because we often flew at night going into places where other aircraft couldn't or wouldn't go. Our job was to extract wounded soldiers, downed pilots, and reconnaissance teams that had gotten into trouble. Marcus turned the pages slowly, seeing image after image of the helicopter and its crew in various settings. Some photos showed them at base camps, cleaning and maintaining the aircraft. Others captured them in more casual moments, playing cards or writing letters home. But there were darker images, too. Photos of the helicopter loaded with wounded soldiers or sitting on makeshift landing zones in jungle clearings. This one here, Henry said, pointing to a particular photograph, was taken after we pulled 12 Marines out of an ambush. They had been pinned down for 6 hours before we could reach them. 3 of them wouldn't have made it another hour. The photograph showed Shadow sitting in a small clearing, her rotors still spinning. Medical personnel were unloading stretchers from the aircraft, while Henry and his co-pilot watched from the cockpit. The expressions on everyone's faces told the story of men who had just cheated death once again. "How many missions did you fly?" Marcus asked, genuinely interested now. "In 2 tours? 437? Henry replied without hesitation. "Every single one of them in that helicopter. She never let us down, never failed to bring us home." Henry opened the manila folder and pulled out several official documents. They were commendations, medals, citations, and mission reports, all bearing various military seals and signatures. Marcus recognized some of the awards: a Distinguished Flying Cross, multiple air medals, a Purple Heart. "I don't usually show these to people," Henry said, "but I think you need to understand what you were laughing at out there." One document caught Marcus's attention. It was a mission report dated December 15, 1972, describing a rescue operation that had gone wrong. According to the report, Henry's helicopter had been hit by enemy fire while attempting to extract a reconnaissance team. Despite significant damage to the aircraft, Henry had managed to complete the mission and return to base with all personnel alive. "That was the mission that ended my flying career," Henry explained, noticing Marcus's focus on the report. "Took shrapnel in my leg and back. Shadow took even more damage than I did. They said she was too badly hurt to repair, that she should be scrapped." "But you kept her," Marcus said, beginning to understand. "I couldn't let them destroy her," Henry replied. "She had given everything for her country, just like the men who flew in her. When I was discharged, I used every penny I had saved to buy her from the military and ship her here." Henry turned to another section of the photo album, showing pictures from the 1970s and 1980s. These images documented Henry's painstaking effort to restore parts of the helicopter. He had spent years tracking down original parts, learning welding and metalwork, and slowly bringing Shadow back to a semblance of her former glory. "I could never afford to make her airworthy again," Henry admitted. "But I could at least preserve her, honor her service. Every piece of rust you see, every dent and scratch, tells a story of lives saved and missions completed." Marcus felt a growing sense of shame as he looked through more photographs. Here were images of Henry working on the helicopter in his younger days, carefully removing damaged sections and replacing them with salvaged parts. There were pictures of neighborhood children gathered around as Henry told them stories about the aircraft's history. There were photos of other veterans who had come to visit Shadow over the years, men who understood her significance in ways that Marcus was only beginning to grasp. "This is why she sits in my backyard," Henry continued. "Not because I can't afford to get rid of her, but because she deserves better than a scrapyard. She deserves to be remembered for what she did, for the lives she saved." Henry showed Marcus a guest book that he kept, filled with signatures and messages from people who had visited Shadow over the years. Many of the entries were from veterans who had served in Vietnam, some of whom had actually been rescued by Henry and his crew. Their messages spoke of gratitude, remembrance, and respect for the aircraft and the men who had flown her. One entry, dated just 3 months earlier, was from a man named Robert Chen. He had written, "Thank you for preserving Shadow. Your crew saved my life on March 23, 1972. I never got the chance to thank you properly until today. My family and I owe you everything." "Mr. Chen lives 2 states away now," Henry explained, "but he drives here every year on the anniversary of his rescue. He brings his grandchildren and tells them the story of how that piece of junk in my backyard saved their grandfather's life." Marcus sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what he had learned. The helicopter he had mocked, the aircraft he had suggested selling for scrap, was actually a decorated war hero with a history of service and sacrifice that put his own comfortable life into stark perspective. "I had no idea," Marcus said quietly. I mean, from the street it just looked like an old man holding on to junk," Henry finished for him. "I know. That's what most people think when they see her now. The years haven't been kind to Shadow, just like they haven't been kind to a lot of us who served." Henry pulled out one more photograph, this one more recent. It showed him standing next to the helicopter with a group of local school children. He was pointing to various parts of the aircraft, clearly explaining its history to the young audience. "I give tours sometimes," Henry explained. "Teachers bring their classes here when they're studying the Vietnam War or military history. The kids are always amazed that this old helicopter sitting in someone's backyard played such an important role in saving lives." Marcus thought about his earlier behavior, about the photos he had taken to share as a joke with his wealthy friends. The idea now seemed not just tasteless, but deeply offensive. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "What I said earlier, the way I acted, it was completely wrong." Henry waved away the apology. "You didn't know. Most people don't. They see an old man in a modest house with what looks like junk in his yard, and they make assumptions." "But that doesn't excuse my behavior," Marcus insisted. "I was rude and arrogant. I judged you and your helicopter without knowing anything about either one." Henry closed the photo album and gathered up the documents. "The question is," he said, "what are you going to do with what you know now?" Marcus wasn't sure how to answer. He felt changed by what he had learned, humbled in a way he couldn't remember ever feeling before. The story of Shadow and Henry's service had put his own life and values into a perspective that made him uncomfortable with who he had become. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I feel like I need to do something, but I don't know what." Henry stood up and walked to the window that overlooked his backyard. Shadow sat there in the fading afternoon light, still looking old and weathered, but now Marcus could see her differently. Instead of rust and decay, he saw history and honor. Instead of worthless junk, he saw a monument to courage and sacrifice. "There is something you could do," Henry said slowly. "Something that would mean more to me than any apology." Marcus waited, hoping for a chance to somehow make amends for his earlier behavior. "Help me tell her story," Henry continued. "Help me make sure that Shadow's legacy doesn't die with me, because someday I won't be here anymore, and I worry about what will happen to her then." Marcus left Henry's house that afternoon completely transformed. The drive back to his expensive neighborhood felt different somehow, as if he was seeing his surroundings through new eyes. The manicured lawns and gleaming luxury cars that had once represented success to him now seemed hollow and superficial compared to the quiet dignity he had witnessed in Henry's modest home. For the next several days, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Shadow and Henry's story. He found himself researching the 1st Cavalry Division online, learning about their operations in Vietnam, and the countless rescue missions they had conducted. He read testimonials from soldiers who had been saved by helicopter crews like Henry's, and with each story, he understood more deeply the significance of what he had almost dismissed as worthless junk. The photos Marcus had taken to share as a joke remained on his phone, but now they served a different purpose. Instead of mocking the old helicopter, he found himself studying every detail, trying to imagine Shadow in her prime, flying dangerous missions over the jungles of Vietnam. He could almost picture the young Henry at the controls, navigating through hostile territory to save lives. A week after his encounter with Henry, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He canceled his golf plans for Saturday morning and drove back to Henry's neighborhood. This time, however, he didn't come empty-handed. He had spent the week researching helicopter restoration, military museums, and veterans organizations. He had also brought something else, a genuine desire to learn and to help. Henry was in his backyard when Marcus arrived, carefully cleaning one of Shadow's panels with a soft cloth. The old veteran looked up in surprise as Marcus approached the fence. "I didn't expect to see you again," Henry said, though his tone was friendly rather than accusatory. "I've been thinking about what you said," Marcus replied, "about helping to tell Shadow's story. I'd like to know more about what that would involve." Henry set down his cleaning cloth and studied Marcus carefully. The arrogant young man who had mocked his helicopter a week earlier seemed to be gone, replaced by someone who appeared genuinely interested and respectful. "Come on back," Henry said, opening the gate. "Let me show you what I've been working on." Over the next several hours, Henry explained his vision for preserving Shadow's legacy. He had been documenting the helicopter's history for years, collecting photographs, mission reports, and testimonials from people who had been touched by the aircraft's service. His goal was to eventually donate these materials to a military museum, along with Shadow herself, so that future generations could learn about the sacrifices made by helicopter crews during the Vietnam War. The problem, Henry explained, was that most museums lacked the resources to properly restore and display such a large artifact. Shadow would need significant work before she could be exhibited, and the cost was far beyond what Henry could afford on his modest pension. "I've contacted several museums over the years," Henry said. "They're interested in the story, but the practical aspects of restoration and display are just too expensive for most of them to consider." Marcus listened carefully, his mind already working on potential solutions. His experience in real estate development had taught him about project management, fundraising, and working with various organizations to achieve complex goals. For the first time since meeting Henry, he saw a way to use his skills and resources for something truly meaningful. "What if we could raise the money for restoration?" Marcus asked. "What if we could find a way to fund the project and ensure that Shadow gets the recognition she deserves?" Henry looked skeptical. "That would take a lot of money, son. More than most people would be willing to spend on an old helicopter." "Let me worry about the money," Marcus said. "You just focus on the story. I think I know some people who might be interested in supporting this kind of project." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the project with an energy and passion that surprised his friends and colleagues. He used his business connections to reach out to veterans organizations, military museums, and historical societies. He contacted local media outlets to share Shadow's story, and he began developing a comprehensive fundraising plan. The response was overwhelming. Once people learned about Shadow's history and Henry's efforts to preserve it, donations began pouring in from unexpected sources. Veterans who had served in Vietnam contributed what they could, often including heartfelt letters about their own experiences. Local businesses offered services and materials at reduced costs. A group of retired mechanics volunteered their time to help with the restoration work. Marcus also used his own resources to support the project. he established a non-profit organization specifically for preserving military aircraft history, and he contributed a significant amount of his own money to get the restoration started. But more importantly, he donated his time and expertise to coordinating the entire effort. The transformation in Marcus was remarkable. The man who had once measured success only in terms of profit margins and status symbols now found himself deeply invested in preserving the legacy of a battered old helicopter and honoring the service of its humble caretaker. As the restoration project gained momentum, Henry and Marcus developed an unlikely friendship. Despite their differences in age, background, and life experience, they found common ground in their shared commitment to Shadow's preservation. Marcus would spend his weekends helping Henry clean and catalog artifacts, while Henry shared more stories about his military service and the men he had served with. The restoration work took nearly 2 years to complete. Professional aircraft mechanics donated hundreds of hours to repair Shadow's damaged sections, replace corroded parts, and restore her original paint scheme. The distinctive Black Panther marking was carefully researched and recreated, returning Shadow to something approaching her wartime appearance. Throughout the process, Marcus documented everything. He interviewed Henry extensively about his service, recorded oral histories from other veterans who had known Shadow, and compiled a comprehensive archive of photographs and documents related to the aircraft's history. The project also attracted the attention of a major military museum in Washington, D.C. Museum officials were so impressed with the restoration work and the documented history that they offered to create a permanent exhibit featuring Shadow as the centerpiece of their Vietnam War collection. On a sunny day in October, nearly 3 years after Marcus first laughed at the old helicopter in Henry's backyard, Shadow was loaded onto a special transport truck for her journey to the museum. The entire neighborhood gathered to watch as the restored aircraft was carefully prepared for transport. Henry stood quietly as his beloved helicopter was secured for the journey. At 80 years old, he moved more slowly than he had when Marcus first met him, but his pride was evident as he watched Shadow receive the respect and recognition she had always deserved. "She looks beautiful," Marcus said, standing beside Henry as the transport truck prepared to leave. "She always was beautiful," Henry replied. "People just couldn't see it under all that rust and neglect." The museum dedication ceremony took place 6 months later. Henry was the guest of honor, and he gave a speech about Shadow's service record that brought many in the audience to tears. Marcus sat in the front row, watching as the man he had once dismissed as just another poor old man received recognition as a genuine American hero. The exhibit was everything Henry had dreamed it would be. Shadow sat in a place of honor, surrounded by photographs, documents, and artifacts that told the story of her service and the men who had flown her. Interactive displays allowed visitors to learn about helicopter operations in Vietnam, while video testimonials from rescued soldiers provided first-hand accounts of Shadow's life-saving missions. But perhaps the most powerful element of the exhibit was a simple plaque that Marcus had commissioned. It read, "In memory of all who served with courage and honor, and in recognition that true value cannot always be measured by appearance alone." The success of Shadow's preservation led to other projects. Marcus's nonprofit organization began working to save other historically significant military aircraft, always partnering with veterans who had personal connections to the machines they were preserving. Henry became an advisor to the organization, sharing his expertise and helping to identify worthy projects. Marcus's life had changed completely from the day he first encountered Henry and Shadow. He still worked in real estate development, but he had restructured his business to focus on projects that benefited communities rather than just maximizing profits. He had sold his expensive BMW and now drove a modest pickup truck that was more practical for transporting restoration materials. More importantly, Marcus had learned to see value in places he never would have looked before. He volunteered regularly at the local Veterans Center, and he had developed friendships with men and women whose stories of service and sacrifice continued to humble and inspire him. 5 years after the museum dedication, Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 85. The funeral service was packed with people whose lives he had touched, fellow veterans, neighborhood children he had mentored, and museum visitors who had been moved by his story. Marcus served as one of Henry's pallbearers, an honor that the old veteran had specifically requested in his will. In his final letter to Marcus, Henry had written, "You helped me ensure that Shadow's story would live on, but more than that, you learned to see the value in things that others might overlook. That's a gift that will serve you well for the rest of your life." Today, Shadow continues to inspire visitors at the museum. School groups regularly tour the exhibit, learning about the Vietnam War and the courage of the men and women who served. Veterans bring their families to see the helicopter and share their own stories of service. And occasionally someone will comment that the old aircraft doesn't look like much, only to be gently corrected by a tour guide who knows Shadow's remarkable history. Marcus visits the exhibit several times a year, usually bringing groups of young people from his community who might benefit from learning about service, sacrifice, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. He never fails to spend a few minutes standing quietly beside Shadow, remembering the day he laughed at an old veteran's beat-up helicopter and learned one of the most important lessons of his life. The helicopter's Black Panther marking gleams proudly under the museum's lights, a symbol of courage that once flew through hostile skies to save lives. And nearby, a photograph shows a young Henry Rodriguez standing beside his aircraft, reminding every visitor that heroes don't always look the way we might expect them to, and that the most valuable things in life are often hidden beneath layers of rust, time, and humble circumstances. Marcus often tells people that meeting Henry and learning about Shadow changed everything for him. It taught him that true worth isn't measured in dollars or status symbols, but in service to others and the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. It's a lesson that continues to guide his life, and one that he hopes to pass on to everyone who hears the remarkable story of the helicopter he once dismissed as junk.